Are all 28 fundamentals equally fundamental? Now, you have been giving me a very positive introduction, Lauren. I hope I can live up to that. But it really is a question that has I have been thinking about a lot. If you have fundamental beliefs, and of course that translates differently into different languages, but if you have fundamental beliefs and you have no less than 28 fundamental, how can they all be fundamental? How can they all be equally fundamental? The sub-question then is, which ones can I question perhaps and still remain a Seventh-day Adventist? Now, some would say that no, you either take the package or you're not a genuine believer, a genuine Seventh-day Adventist. While others would say, well, wait a minute. I can make my own choice as to what I feel is really fundamental for me. Anyway, I was baptized quite a few years ago, and at that time, we only had 22 fundamental beliefs. And I believe that would be true for quite a few others who are at the moment in this seminar. Now let's look at Adventism and diversity. We believe, or we want to be, a unified church. That's the whole idea of our administration. We want to do the same things everywhere in the world at the same time. We want to have unity. We want to believe the same things. But reality, is there not an increasing diversity? I think honesty demands that we agree that there is. David Newman, who at one time was the editor of Ministry magazine, wrote an interesting article in 1994. And he then suggested that really, rather than talking about one type of Adventism, we should look at 4 different types of Adventism. And he said there is mainstream Adventism, and then he pointed to evangelical Adventism, progressive Adventism, historic Adventism. Now, if we look at those terms today, maybe we don't find it so easy to really define what exactly is evangelical Adventism and what exactly is progressive Adventism. Maybe it's a little easier to define historic Adventism. But Newman was right in saying reality demands that we see an increasing diversity within our ranks. There is a website that at one time I hit on by chance, and I've never found out who exactly is the author or the organization behind that particular website. But there it says, and this is quite a few years ago already, that there are actually 8 different branches of Adventism, types of Adventism. And there on that website, it talks about liberals, progressives, supporters of the moral influence theory, evangelicals, moderates, conservatives and traditionalists, ultra-conservatives, and extreme ultra-conservatives. And there are some, they give some names together with each category, and some among the ultra-conservatives and extreme ultra-conservatives I would not classify as Adventist at all. And I was happy to see my name listed among the group of progressive Seventh-day Adventists. But without spending too much time on this, this is another indication that people notice that we are not all that united as some would like us to be. In early Adventism, there already was a significant diversity. Leaders came from diverse backgrounds, from different denominations. Many doctrines for many years remained in a flux, and only gradually a consensus was reached as to what was Adventist teaching. Take some examples of issues where it took a time to reach unity: the shut door versus the open door, the idea that after 1844, there really was no more time to go and convince people. You either were in or out, the shut door or the open door. The Sabbath, there gradually became, or quite soon there was a consensus that we should keep the Sabbath, but there was no consensus on when we should begin the Sabbath. Was it at 6 o'clock? Was it at midnight? Only gradually there was unanimity that it should be at sundown. And even there were some issues to solve. There was a diversity in prophetic interpretation. Uriah Smith, James White, and others, they did not all agree on every detail of prophetic interpretation. There was disagreement in organizational matters. Some felt we needed to organize because otherwise we couldn't function, we couldn't do our job, we couldn't preach. Others said organizing means we are joining Babylon. These were just a few examples where it took time to reach a consensus. But gradually, on most of some of the essential elements of our teachings, consensus was reached. And I have listed the crucial ones: continued validity of God's law, including the Sabbath, the premillennial literal return of Christ coming before the 1,000-year period, before the millennium would start, a consensus about there is a heavenly sanctuary and Christ is officiating as our heavenly high priest, and gradually there was the consensus that he had done so from 1844 onwards. Salvation through Christ, though often with legalistic undertones. Believers' baptism, there was never much of a problem with regard to believers' baptism, adults at the following the free choice of the individual to become a follower of Christ. A high view of the Bible, with a tendency perhaps to be fundamentalistic, but there was a high view of the Bible. Conditional immortality, very early on, this was our view about death and resurrection. And then an item that was always there from the beginning, the historicist interpretation of apocalyptic prophecy. So gradually, there was quite a bit of consensus reached on a number of important points that were to be Adventist doctrine. Some things took a bit longer. Our views on clean and unclean meat, they took a couple of decades before they were really clear to the majority of our believers. Vegetarianism, well, even though some people think that that is an item that we're all united on even today, it seems that worldwide only 25 to 30% are actually vegetarians. Righteousness by faith, until 1888, the discussion went on, and beyond 1888, it has gone on. And even today, righteousness by faith, it took a lot longer before that was really part of the genius of Adventism. Tithing, there was a system of systematic benevolence based not so much on what you earn, but on what you possess. And gradually that system of support for the church was replaced by tithing, but that took also a couple of decades. It was a long process for the church to really grow into acceptance of the Trinitarian doctrine. And it seems that today a segment of the church is going back on that. But it was only until the 1950s and the time of question on doctrine that we were really united, at least to a major extent, on belief in the Trinity and the full divinity of Christ and the personhood of the Holy Spirit. Those things that are key factors of traditional or historic Christianity. However, there was never a complete uniformity of opinion in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And Ellen White wrote in 1890 that the brethren should not feel that it is a virtue to stand apart because they do not see all minor points in the same light. If on fundamental truth they are at agreement, they should not differ and dispute about matters of little real importance. Now, for a non-English speaker, this is a bit of a strange wording, but to me it says that if we are in agreement on fundamental truth, then if we differ and dispute matters of little importance, that doesn't really matter. Well, I believe that there are quite a few people in our church that should read this statement maybe a bit more regularly. Our pioneers said that we should not really need a creed. We should not have a creed. We should only have the Bible. And that explains the reluctance to, initially at least, to formulate statements of belief. John Loughborough, there is a question as to whether he can still be reckoned to be among the pioneers, but let's say he was a pioneer of the second generation. And he made this famous statement. The first step, he said, of apostasy is to get up a creed, telling us what we shall believe. The second is to make that creed a test of fellowship. The third is to try members by that creed. The fourth is to denounce as heretics those who do not believe that creed. And the fifth is to commence persecution as such. That's quite a statement. And I think that it's something worthwhile to keep in mind. But fundamental beliefs and de facto, in actual fact, creedal statements, they did come. A first summary of beliefs was already there in 1863. A few points listed by James White. But a more fuller statement, 25 different articles, was written in 1872. Interestingly, it stated in the preamble to this statement that it was not to secure uniformity, but to meet inquiries. So in actual fact, this was more a public relations venture than anything else. People would write to the office of the church and say, "You Adventists, what do you believe?" And James White felt there needed to be, and the other editors there felt there needed to be some kind of listing so that people would know what Adventists believe. It is to meet inquiries from the public, not to say to the believers, this is what you need to believe. It was descriptive rather than proscriptive. We find that in the end of the 1910s, beginning of the 1920s, there are various doctrinal summaries in a number of our papers. And a lot of the wording of these various summaries is found in the formal statement of 1931, which is probably the basis of the statement that we have today. 22 articles, fundamental beliefs, 1931. We lived with those 22 articles for 50 years. 1980, there are the 27 fundamental beliefs. 25 years later, a 28th article was added, and just recently, 2015, there were some major revisions. Zooming in on this a little bit, in the Pearson era, Robert Pearson, who was the General Conference president between 1969 and 1976, in that era, there was an enormous stress on uniformity. And there was a lot of emphasis on the fact that theology teachers we ought to be sure that they teach the real Seventh-day Adventist truth and doctrine. And administrators ought to fully support the kosher theology that the church had agreed upon. The present attempt to make university theology professors sign all kinds of documents to ensure that they teach sound doctrine, that is something that we already see in the Pearson era. In 1980, there was in Dallas, in the time of Neil Wilson, the document of the 27 fundamental beliefs. There was a considerable input from Andrews University theologians, and I believe that the preamble that was in a late stage edit to the statement was by Ron Graybill. Maybe somewhat surprising that somebody like Jan Paulsen would, during his presidency, see to the adding of the 28th point. Well, in fact, Paulsen, and he actually told me that one of his ideas behind this was to show that these fundamental beliefs could indeed be edited or changed if needs be. And here was from Africa major pressure to add something that would deal with the concerns about African religions that they had. So the order of the 28 fundamental beliefs was somewhat altered, and number 28 was added. 2015 in Atlanta, this is in the presidency of Ted Wilson, who pushed for a more precise definition of creation as being something that happened in 6 literal days in 1 literal week. And that was something that was recent, meaning something like between 6,000 and 10,000 years. And specifying that the flood that we find in Noah's time in Genesis was something that was truly global, that is covering the entire earth. That was something of the background of these fundamental beliefs, and we wonder, of course, what is the future? Will we have further additions to the 28 fundamental beliefs, or will it at some point in time be possible to maybe reduce the number of fundamental beliefs? There's no doubt that there are lots of people in the church today who have lots of questions about a number of these fundamental beliefs. And here are, I think, some of the most important questions that people have. Questions about how to read the Bible. Many are not happy about the growing fundamentalism that they see in their church. How do we read the Bible? Plain reading, as that Wilson likes to say. The topic of creation. Many people in the church simply cannot agree with the wording that we now find in fundamental belief number 6 about the creation of everything. There are doctrinal questions today, certainly about the Trinity. In different sectors of the church, there are people who feel that the Trinity is really something that we owe to the Roman Catholics. It's something that we should get rid of, because it's something that is inherited from Babylon. Whereas others, and I'm among them, feel that this is one of the crucial elements of the Christian faith. There is a discussion, quite a bit of discussion about the nature of Christ, in particular about the human nature of Christ. In those, among those that believe in last generation theology, there is the idea that Christ did have the kind of human nature that Adam had after his fall into sin. And so if Christ could then be sinless, having that particular human nature, then of course we should be able to be sinless as well. And the last generation before Christ comes must reach that state. Now, many people, far too many around the world, have that kind of belief. And fortunately, there are also many who do not believe that that is the right teaching. Through the centuries, well, it's almost centuries now, but at least through time, there have been people in the church who have questioned the doctrine of the heavenly sanctuary, the doctrine of the investigative judgment, the calculation behind 1844, and even in spite of all the lesson quarterlies that we have, and we have one currently, there are more and more people, I believe, in the church who feel that these are some of the things that are up for revision. End-time prophecies, the kind of enemy thinking that we still find in the church, many people are unhappy with that. The remnant, the question, who are the remnant? Only the Seventh-day Adventist Church, or just a part of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, or are the remnant eventually all those people who side with God and who are on God's side? Ellen White, well, there's so many things that have become known through research from various people that it's clear the church needs to deal with the issues surrounding the person and the work of Ellen White. So there are lots of questions people have today. And there are matters that maybe are of a different level where people also differ. The way people keep the Sabbath, we all keep the Sabbath, yes, but we do it in different ways. And there's a lot of discussion about it. The wearing of jewelry, it's no issue in some places, for instance, where I live, but it is a big issue in other places in the world. Carrying arms and some of the other things that are part, in particular, of American society, which are alarming to many believers in other parts of the world. Drinking of coffee, tea, for For some, this is a very major thing. For many others, this is something that is no longer an issue, and we enjoy our cup of coffee and tea. Issue of race. For many in the world, this idea of having regional conferences, the idea that you would have different organizations in the church for people with a different color of skin, is just something that people cannot understand. And I must admit, it has been explained to me many times by people of various colors of skin, but I still don't think this is a very good idea. And it's just something that I feel is very difficult to explain to other people here in the country where I live. Gender equality, ordination of women, that's where, of course, we continue to differ. There is the issue of sexual orientation. In some parts of the world, fortunately, we begin to see that sexual orientation is not a matter of choice, but it is how we are, and that we should welcome all people, regardless of their orientation, into the church. Fortunately, that is become clear to many, but unfortunately, we'll have a very, very long way to go. So the main problem that I now want to deal with is, if there is this diversity, if we think differently on many issues, is actually everything of the same importance? And well, I think actual experience says that that is not how Seventh-day Adventists generally think. If you ask an average congregation or group of Adventists, tell us, what are the main doctrines of the Seventh-day Adventist Church? They would have a short list of about 7 or 8 or 10 at most doctrines. And these lists would be pretty much the same wherever you ask that question. And there are lots of doctrines that would actually never or seldom be mentioned. So the experience of most Seventh-day Adventists is that there is a difference in importance. Not all doctrines are at the same level. Well, actually, the baptismal questions do not cover all doctrinal points and all the details that some people find so important. So apparently there is some difference between what should be asked and what we are supposed to believe. I think it's an important issue that we're dealing with here, because there is always the danger that we give the highest priority to secondary matters, to things that are not so important, and we give little priority to actually what is the most basic in our faith. And when we look back, and that's what most people or many people like to do, not everything in the past was given the same level of importance. In early Adventism, people were convinced that there was a dynamic nature of truth. Truth developed, truth grew. We would find present truth in the different eras of our existence. Ellen White would speak very often about the pillars of the truth. And then she mentioned just a few of the doctrines that had become prominent in the church. And that description was somewhat fluid. It was not always the same list of pillars that she mentioned. But mostly she pointed to scriptures and then to the three angels' messages, to the issue of Daniel 8:14, the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary, investigative judgment, the Sabbath and the perpetuity of the moral law, the non-immortality of the wicked, the conditional immortality, in other words. These were for Ellen White among the pillars of the truth. And it's interesting also that the 1870 statement that we referred to earlier is headed, has as its title, the main features of our faith. In other words, there are many features, but some are the most important features. So there is a difference in level of importance. In medicine, there is a term that is called triage. And I think most of you are acquainted with that term. When you have a disaster and you have many victims, then the medical people, they will see which are the patients that needed urgent treatment and which patients do not need urgent treatment because they are beyond treatment or because their situation is not that serious. And there have been many theologians that have suggested that when it comes to doctrine, we also might need a theological triage. And there are various models that have been suggested, and often these models had two tiers. One, doctrines found in the early Christian creeds. They were the most foundational, the most crucial, and then a second level doctrines that are peculiar to individual denominations, to the Baptist, the Methodist, the Adventist, etc. And it's been suggested that we make sure that we see the difference, and that we also see that the doctrines that the early church agreed on are the most foundational for Christianity. Most of you may have heard the name of Woodrow Wilson. It's always interesting when I see American names followed by the second or the third. That is something that we do not know in this part of the world, but Woodrow Wilson always is mentioned as the second. And in his book, he's written quite a few books, but in his book, Ellen White and the Humanity of Christ, there he makes a suggestion that maybe we as Seventh-day Adventists should have three tiers in our doctrinal structure. That we should first have, as the most basic, the historic Christian doctrines, doctrine of God, doctrine of the Trinity, the two natures of Christ, etc. And then we should have the essential Adventist doctrines and the non-essential Adventist doctrines. Now, of course, that immediately raises the question, what is essential and what is non-essential? But even though he recognizes that that is a difficult question to answer, we all, well, maybe not all, but most Seventh-day Adventists feel that there is such a distinction between essential and less essential, if not non-essential, and that we should be able to discuss that and make sure that we see the difference. Well, I would like to add my proposal to this. It's not that earth-shocking, but maybe it would be good if we look at our doctrinal structure as a number of concentric circles, where we say that at the center, and that is basic, there is Jesus Christ. Everything has its basis, is around him, at the center, Jesus Christ. The first concentric circle, then, the foundational Christian doctrinal principles. The second concentric circle, the essential Adventist doctrinal principles. And following Woodrow Whedon, the less essential Adventist doctrines and main lifestyle issues. And then perhaps a fourth concentric circle. And I would say there should not be an uninterrupted line between 3 and 4, and maybe 4 and the outer world. There should not be an uninterrupted line, but rather what do you call that? A stipple line? A dotted line. I'm just asking my wife to translate a Dutch term for me. So, but there is a difference between essential Adventist doctrine, less essential Adventist doctrine, and then ideas and cultural and time-related interpretations, and often differing from place to place where you are in the world. So that is what I suggest. But I realize that that is no final answer, and that you can have long discussions about what exactly should be in number 1, what exactly should be in number 2, or in 3, or in 4. Well, category 1, the first concentric circle, I would suggest the triune God as creator and sustainer, salvation through Christ, the availability of eternal life, the active presence of the Holy Spirit, inspiration of the Bible, however defined, the fact that there is a revealed moral code, and that God has wanted to have a church and has given the church spiritual gifts. Those, I would suggest, are some of the basic Christian doctrines that are in the first category. They are most important. Adventist essentials. These are the things that Adventists would mention when you ask them, what is important for you? What do you feel what does it mean to be a Seventh-day Adventist? Keeping the seventh-day Sabbath, the fact that Christ is going to come, the premillennial return of Jesus Christ, believers' baptism, that is of adults, conditional immortality, death as a sleep, and then the resurrection, Christ as high priest, and the idea of stewardship that is worked out in different areas of our lives. These are, it seems to me, essential Adventist doctrines that are in this second category. Now things are getting a little precarious, maybe. Secondary Adventist beliefs. And here, well, maybe there are many who are now in our group today who would say, now, wait a minute, are they secondary historicist interpretation of prophecy? The year-day principle? Well, actually, you know, that is not mentioned in our 28 fundamental belief even. It's something that is understood to be important for Adventism, but it's not spelled out in our 28 fundamental beliefs. And there are lots of questions about this particular point in time. The historicist interpretation of prophecy and the day-year principle with all that it involves. The investigative judgment, 1844. Now, some people would say, this is vital for Seventh-day Adventism. If you take this away, you don't have an Adventist church left. Well, ask many people in the church how many understand the doctrine of the investigative judgment. How many people can tell you, how do you arrive at 1844? It's only a very small percentage of the people that can explain that to you. So how can that be a fundamental belief if so many people either cannot understand it or have long forgotten it when they, after they were first maybe taught this particular doctrine? Tithing, well, yes, it's important for the administration of the church, but is that a crucial doctrine when you look at all the biblical evidence? Foot washing, well, I have no desire to do away with it, but actually, if you look at the example that Christ has given, you would say it's the pastor who should bow down and wash the feet of the church members. Dietary laws, well, are they among the crucial doctrines of the church, or are they of a different kind of level? The total rejection of alcohol, again, I have no desire to start drinking alcohol, on the contrary, but to say that it is an important doctrine of the church, total rejection, that is taking it a bit far. So, although you may want to put maybe some of the items from category 3 into category 2, I believe there is a certain amount of difference in importance between those categories. And it's certainly also when we come to category number 4, when there are specific prophetic interpretations and issues surrounding the ministry of Ellen G. White, Sabbath-keeping practices and styles of worship, jewelry, etc., etc. They may be common ideas that have grown up in the church, that have developed, but it's difficult to say what kind of biblical foundation there is for some of these ideas that have developed. So, category 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Is that something that we can entertain, this kind of idea? When I'm coming back to the original question, are all fundamental beliefs equally fundamental? If you ask me, my answer is no. They are not all equally fundamental. Do I have a clear picture as to where each doctrine would fit? Maybe not for all of them, but I clearly see that there are different levels of importance. Well, that brings us to the next question then. Who is a genuine Adventist? Who is a real Adventist? And all too often we hear people, even representatives of the highest organs of the church, say, well, if you do not believe that, then you are not a real Adventist. So who is a real Adventist? Only those who say yes to all details of what we find in the 28 fundamental beliefs. I think there are at least 4 factors to consider. What is our attitude towards the key Christian doctrines, the key Christian values, and the key Adventist doctrines? In particular, then I'm thinking of category 1 and 2. What is our affinity with the Adventist lifestyle? Without having some kind of legalistic list of do's and don'ts, but a real Adventist has a real affinity with what we loosely call the Adventist lifestyle, and has an affinity with the Adventist faith community. Those are factors I believe we need to consider in answer to the question, who is a real Seventh-day Adventist? Well, Am I a real Seventh-day Adventist? Who determines that? Whether I'm a real Seventh-day Adventist, whether Lauren Siebold is a real Seventh-day Adventist, and many of the others here in our group tonight, or well, rather, where you are this morning or this afternoon. Does the General Conference have that right? It seems that they seem to say yes to that question, that they must set the standards and they must have these things voted at the World Congress once every 5 years. But is that true? Does the General Conference determine whether I'm a genuine Adventist? Or the union, conference? It's a good thing that in our denomination, it is the local church that has authority over membership. There's no one in the United States, no one in Great Britain, where we have the division, that has any say about whether I can be a member of the church, yes or no. It is the local church where I worship. That is the entity that recognizes me as a member, or does no longer want to recognize me as a member. And that is the authority that can decide whether I can have an active role in my church or not. And then in the end, there's also myself. Do I see myself as a genuine Seventh-day Adventist? Do I really continue to identify with that group of people that calls themselves the Adventist Church? And that is a very important question that I have to decide for myself. Fritz Guy, a name well known to most of you, he has in his book about, well, I'm trying to think of the title of the book, but it'll come back to me in a moment. He says, a real Adventist is somebody who is open to present truth. In other words, who accepts the dynamism of truth that develops, that grows, that matures. A true Adventist has God's universal love at the center of her thinking, understands the meaning of the Sabbath for our time. A real Adventist lives in hopeful expectation of Christ's return and subscribes to the multi-dimensional human well-being, chooses the Adventist community as her spiritual home, and accepts the Adventist past of part of her identity. When I look at this little list by Fritz Guy, I think that is probably the best description that I've ever read of who can be considered a genuine, a true Seventh-day Adventist. I fully agree with this little list that Dr. Guy has given us. And it's important that while we are thinking about issues regarding the fundamental doctrines, that we no longer think of the doctrines as some kind of imprisonment. This is what we have to believe otherwise. No, as Christians, we must claim our freedom. Yes, it must be a responsible freedom if we want to function within that community. But, and I'm quoting from the Message version of Galatians 5, verse 1, Christ has set us free to live a free life. So take your stand. Never again let anyone put a harness of slavery on you. Unfortunately, it seems that the document of the 28 fundamental beliefs is at least functions, as a harness of slavery for many people in our community. Paul says that should not be. Christ has set us free to live a free life. So take your stand. Never again let anyone put a harness of slavery on you. So what do? We should welcome diversity. There was diversity from the beginning in our faith community. There should continue to be diversity. But we should do all we can to stay united on crucial matters. And then, with our different ideas and our different practices, complement and supplement each other as the body of Christ. We should encourage dialogue, learning about and from each other. In different cultures, people with different perspectives, and have patience with one another. And then avoid, or at least reduce, polarization while allowing for a generous spaciousness. And that's a term that I picked up from a book title recently, and I think I love that term, generous spaciousness. That is what we ought to extend to one another in the church to which we belong.